Hi, and welcome to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host, and today in Unplanned, we're going to get the chance to talk to somebody who is a friend of mine, but is also very deeply involved in a lot of the big development decisions going on here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Before we get to him, let me remind you to subscribe to Unplanned. We're going to have lots more interesting conversations to come in the future. But without further ado, let me welcome you to the roof of the Blue Garage here, just off Broadway in East Cambridge, in the Kendall Square area, and introduce Mike Tilford, who is the Vice President of Development for Boston Properties. Do I have that correct?
You've got it correct, Sam.
Excellent, wonderful. And Mike and I are going to talk about a lot of issues related to Boston Properties, who's a big developer here in Cambridge, and some of the interesting projects that he's been working on. But why don't I stop talking and welcome you, Mike.
Sam, I appreciate it. I've never done a podcast before, and I enjoy what I do immensely, so the chance to share it is a lot of fun. What would you like to talk about?
Yeah, well, why don't we get into it? First of all, where the heck are we? And I want to just tell our viewers that they should enjoy, as Mike described it, the Eastern European look of the blank concrete slab that extends out behind us. But why don't we start right here? Where are we, and what is this structure we're on right now?
We're on top of what we call the Blue Garage, which is a roughly 1,100 car structure that serves the parking needs of the commercial buildings around us. You know, I know that parking and transit is probably at least a few podcast episodes on its own, so I won't get into that. But you know, this was built in the 80s to serve our initial development of what we call the North Parcel. Right over there is Broadway, and then you have Galileo on the distance. So this is in the middle of the entire park. And so the Blue Garage serves parking needs, and that's what it does.
All right, well, before we get too into actual specifics, why don't we take a step back and talk about Boston Properties, talk about the job you do and the things that you're thinking about on a day-to-day. Let's start with Boston Properties, then we can talk a little bit about your day job and what you do at work.
Sure. Boston Properties is a real estate investment trust that has developments and buildings in Boston, Cambridge, and Waltham locally, but also in Washington, D.C., New York, San Francisco, and a little bit in L.A. It was founded by Mort Zuckerman and Ed Lindy, and has grown to what it is. We're a long-term holder of assets.
What does that mean? Just describe for the viewer.
I think developers are often seen in a very monolithic way. There's all kinds of developers. A real estate investment trust is a tax structure in one sense, but we own and develop buildings and hold on to them. So we stay in the communities we started with for a very long time. We don't sell buildings just for a lot of reasons. Sometimes we do, but generally not. Other developers may put up a building and do a great job on it and find a tenant and then sell that to a longer term holder, maybe a pension fund, maybe an investor. So that's just two examples of the kinds of flavors. I think what makes us a little different is our history with Cambridge and our plans to be here for the long term.
And let's stay on that for just a second longer. What do you think that means for the communities in which you participate, where you're located, as compared to some of the other developers? Because I don't think it's a great stretch to say to people, if you've ever been to a community meeting, there's at least one bad guy in the room, and that's always the developer. There's no question. It doesn't matter what size building, what the project is, what the issue is. The developer's always the bad guy or the bad gal or whoever. But how would you describe just what is the difference between somebody who's going to be in a community and somebody who's not going to be in a community?
I think we develop a history, and we're human beings like everybody else. I think we do some things really well. I think other things we could always improve on. The difference is, if you're around for the long term, what you can improve on and how you engage with the communities you build in has the opportunity for an ongoing dialogue, has the opportunity for improvement, frankly. Whereas if we were just to build and then sell and vacate, that dialogue, who you started the conversation with, would change to whoever ends up owning the building in the future. So I think that's a distinction that's important because, particularly in Cambridge, and I've had the pleasure and benefit to work in a lot of different communities. This is a very engaged community. People who are really, really passionate about where they live and what happens to it and who impacts it. So I think having that longer term dialogue is a service to both groups.
And let's add, before we get on to your day job and the kind of work that you're working on, Boston Properties has been around a long time. One of the fascinating things about Kendall Square, where we're located right now, is the initial position that Boston Properties was willing to take on way back in the 80s, way back when this was nothing but parking lots and there was a lot of disinvestment in cities. That whole story is a fascinating story all by itself. But before we get onto that, what are you working on? What's your project list? What's your day job?
I focus, and I have for the last 3.5 years, pretty much solely in Cambridge in a 3-block area. I was lucky enough to get to be the project manager on the Akamai building, which I enjoyed and learned a lot.
Which I think we can say is right next door to us, right here.
Right next door to the Blue Garage here, just recently completed. I'm working on Google's new building over on Main Street, and then spending most of my time on Eversource. And
well, let's take Akamai in some ways might be the biggest of the 3 names you just mentioned, but Google's the one we all know. Let's just take a second on the Google building. What does that mean when you say you're working on the Google building? First of all, Google's here in Cambridge, I assume, and what are they doing?
Yep.
What are they up to?
That's everything, it seems like. They're clearly expanding, and they wanted a larger presence in Cambridge. A lot of tech companies, love this area for talent acquisition and proximity to other people. Even, we'll see how the post-COVID times work, but that appears to be a resonant desire still. Brian Coop, who runs our region, does a really great job explaining that ecosystem far better than I could. Again, I'm a bricks and sticks guy. And so, Google's headquarters is an expansion for what they currently have. And it's, what does that mean for us? We design with the client, so a building, and the city. There's 3 legs to that stool because planning staff, the CRA, people have lots of opinions on how buildings present themselves. We then take those documents through pricing, and we go through multiple layers of a entitlement process, which in the MXD has a dual jurisdiction of the city, of course, as well as the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority and their board. So
as you go through these names and these acronyms, don't get too wonky, because we want general viewers to be able to follow what's going on here. But yeah, keep going.
Yeah, I think most people have a good understanding that when you want to develop something, there's usually a municipal entity which is part of that process, and depending upon which municipality you're entering into, that process can be very different. Here in Cambridge, it's the city, obviously, and there are multiple departments, from public works to their planning department to traffic. I mean, they really have a broad array of talents over there. And then the Cambridge Redevelopment Authority, which is the quasi-public entity that governs the MXD district, and their board as well.
So that's Google, and Google is expanding because they were here already, right?
They were here already, yep.
Yeah. Yep. And that's true for a lot of the names that everybody would know here in, they have a presence here in Kendall Square. It's part of what makes this place such an interesting place on planet Earth, I would say.
It's really unique. You don't see this kind of agglomeration or clustering of this kind of thought and talent and just incredible ideas. So I think Cambridge has fostered that both through its community as well as its educational infrastructure, and then the private sector. So it's really a pretty thriving ecosystem that is like nowhere else on the planet.
So if we can, and I don't know how much you can talk about it because I think it's an ongoing project, but Eversource, you mentioned Eversource, and it's a fascinating piece of urban development, land use, planning, the kind of moving pieces around the chessboard to see if you can come up with a better solution to a problem that might have been solved 40 or 50 years ago. What can you tell us about Eversource? And give us a little bit of background so we know what it is. And
100%, and it's an easy one to talk about because of our partners at the CRA, who have a lot of the urban design vision, are very focused on public process. There isn't much we haven't said already publicly. It's a very different development. So there's nothing that's really hands off or secret or anything like that at all. My understanding, 2016, Eversource purchased a parcel from a developer. that parcel is going to have been a 3-story, kind of a nice low-rise residential building right across from a park, the Kennedy Longfellow School.
That's all. This is in Eastern Cambridge.
East Cambridge. Really, just you can stand on that side of our desolate garage. You can see it from there. And my understanding is, and Eversource does a way better job of speaking to this. It was 2 reasons. One is to provide additional electrical capacity to the area. Power is a bit fungible. But obviously, there's a lot of people using it, both in laboratory and tech environments, as well as the surrounding neighborhoods. And the other, maybe more importantly, is redundancy, to have a second ability to serve this area. So most places are served with redundant capacities because power outages, sadly, with the time we're in, are becoming more common, natural disasters, etc. So that was the reason they wanted it. No one paid attention, myself included, until 2018 when they proposed a substation. There was a lot of community concern. I think you probably know better people to speak with to articulate that. My understanding is, its proximity to a school was a concern to people, and it being a big piece of commercial seeming infrastructure right next to a residential neighborhood caused a lot of people to be very upset about it. So the city, in a very proactive fashion, via DPW and the city manager's office, asked all the developers to come in, and they described the issue, and they asked for proposals. And that doesn't usually happen. And so we started tossing things around in the office, and that was a whole lot of our different people in different departments, and asked ourselves, could we bury this garage and bury a substation and build buildings around it and use those buildings to finance what's effectively a massive infrastructure overhaul.
And when you say this garage, do you mean this garage?
The one we are sitting on right now.
Well, that answers the question, which was partly my question too. Why we're sitting on this huge slab of concrete here. So that's why we're here.
Yeah, it is really, it's that. It's an impediment back to this urban planning that I've learned about. Again, you studied it, you are an urban planner, Tom Evans is there, city staff. This is somewhat of an impediment to a grid system. Volpe is right, again, over there. We're very much in the middle.
Yeah. Volpe is the U.S. Department of Transportation research building, and there's a whole history to the building, and it's a fascinating history. And we won't go into it right here, but just know that the building itself is right over there.
Absolutely, and it's large redevelopment capacity, which Timco is bringing forth. But how do you connect these places and not make them feel like a single-use, cut-off environment, one that's actually open and porous? And this is literally a physical impediment to that. So it takes away these direct orthogonal crosscuts, which could exist as pedestrian cut-throughs. And parking garages are an unfortunate necessity. We'll see what the future of transportation holds post-COVID. I think everyone's paying close attention to that. But what do you do? How do you park things in a dense urban environment? And it's not a fun use. It's not aesthetically particularly pleasing. Again, it's a necessity. That's why we sort of put it in the middle. There's a back door to everything, but we think it could open up a new opportunity for what this whole area could be if this weren't here.
Well, can you speak to, because that's always an interesting component in all of this, and certainly in city building and in development and in urban planning, and on the city side, the public side, where you're trying to protect and defend the public's interest in the issue. That mix between a private, let's say, developer's interests, and then a more generalized public interest of citizens at large who may or may not interact with this building, but have a stake in the outcome, have a stake in what gets built. And it's a complicated dance that goes on in that whole process.
Oh yeah, and it varies so much from community to community. One of the fun parts about development for me is it's this sort of intersection of the social, the physical, the financial, and it is a delicate and fragile thing. I'm not too sure I could wax on about sort of general observations, but yeah, you have to, again, being a long-term owner particularly, or somebody who's been engaged in your community for a long time, there are 3 legs to the stool, obviously. There's what we're doing, and we're quite plain about this. We're a publicly traded real estate investment trust. We serve our shareholders, and we do that through making profits off of development and ownership of buildings. The public, obviously, as represented by various groups, sometimes it's city departments, sometimes it's individuals, sometimes organized groups. they have an interest because they live here, and they want something that is engaging and interesting, and sometimes they want less, sometimes they want more. Again, it varies as much as the people you're talking to. And then of course, the clients who want to be here. Oftentimes there isn't a lot of conversation around the human beings that work in these buildings. They're usually your neighbors and residents, but sometimes these buildings are regarded as sort of monoliths without a lot of thought to who's inside there. So part of our role is to also advocate for that population who work principally in these areas, and in some cases live.
Yeah. So you've mentioned COVID a bunch of times, and we're living in.
I'm sorry.
No. We're living in COVID times, and as I often say on Unplanned, a show about cities and how they work, is Unplanned actually started because, and I say this almost every episode, is that it just popped into my head one day. It allowed us to run the experiment we never thought we could run, which is, what if you shut down an entire city for an entire day? And sure enough, we did it. And we did it here and around the globe, and we saw a lot of things about the systems we've created and sort of the way we do things, including the implicit or implied ways we do things, and some of those work well and some of those work horribly badly.
Yeah.
And you obviously, both as an individual but also in your professional day job, have a lot of interests that had to completely readjust in March and April of this past year. So,
oh geez, yeah.
I mean, talk to us a little bit about what that experience was like and what that was all about.
Wow. I mean, and it's like a story being written every day. And so, speaking solely for myself and not for my company or any official lines, I mean, you wonder about the future of work. I mean, there were a lot of, I think, hyperbolic headlines initially, and some of the hyperbole is fair because we didn't know as much as we know now. We still don't know everything. There's a lot left to learn, but we've learned a lot over the last few months about what this is and how it works. I mean, there were discussions about no one using an elevator ever again, and no one ever going back to the office, and what's the point of an office, and so you start questioning some of those fundamentals. I really don't believe that, quite truthfully, that no one's going back to the office. I think it's generally written by people who didn't like going to the office in the first place. I have always enjoyed work, so it's different. But so that was a moment of great uncertainty. And then there was the reality that we had many clients that were still coming in. We had people in our own organization that were coming in, our property managers every day, and we had to, how do you face this responsibly? Are you comfortable? I've been back at the office for a few months, and again, that's just me. Everyone has to underwrite their own risks and their own tolerances, differently in any segment of the area. So I think that was the next step is, what do we do about it?
Right.
And there's been all kinds of discussions about UV light, HVAC systems. Some is speculation, some is science, and how does a built environment adapt to those important health considerations? And then you get to the question of, some of the fun things. There's not a lot of traffic necessarily. I think everyone enjoyed that. And will there be a rethinking of what constitutes the work week, let alone the work day? And I think that's going to be a collective decision between the people, the talent, and the organizations. Will be open for them regardless of when they want to be at work. So
yeah,
it's a story being written on that. I mean, it's unfolding.
Yeah. Mike, I want to just thank you for coming out and spending some time with us on Unplanned.
I appreciate the opportunity.
So to close it out, let me do what I'm going to call the lightning round. And it's just to get your quick takes on a couple of big topics that we've already mentioned, but what do you think the future holds? Where are we going to be at with transportation? Where are we now? I
mean, again, that's a topic that you could probably create a couple of episodes about with lots of thoughtful people. The Red Line, we're so lucky to have it here. I moved from a city where we didn't have any transit, and so I've loved the MBTA. There's not going to be a single politician or leader or department head who's going to declare things safe or unsafe. It'll be a collective decision of when people go back and start using it. But I think it'll be a necessity too. It's just such an artery still. We need this in Massachusetts, in Boston specifically. So that comes back. When is going to be a collective decision? Cycling is going to probably, I think, take off. We'll see how many people in the winter get into it. But with the raised cycle tracks we're installing as part of the public benefits arrangements, which are a cycle facility about 8 feet, 6 feet wide, raised up by 6 inches and protected by a curb. So it really reduces interaction both with pedestrians and with cars. And as a multimodal commuter myself, who's pretty conservative, I feel way safer on those than I do in a painted lane, for example. So I think that cities like Cambridge particularly driving that, a lot of rail trail projects, that infrastructure will continue to spread. And then micromobility. I think it's a lot of fun. I know there's discussions on electric scooters and if they're safe or not. I had the chance to ride one in Portland before COVID, and I thought it was a lot of great time. And that won't be the only micromobility solution. There'll be a lot more of those.
Yeah, and we'll point out just that I assume in your projects that you're building, you're required to put in some of these cycle tracks and things like that.
Yep, it's very much so. I mean, there's a big body of case law and how all that's governed, and at the end of the day, when there's a impact as far as putting higher density in a city, cities look to mitigate those impacts, and they need to be proximate, have a central nexus, a relationship to the impact. It can't just be something totally random, and generally speaking, they are. And so if you're going to put more people into a place, you have to help facilitate solutions to move people around. So the cycle tracks are a big part of that.
Actually, that makes me think that would be a fascinating conversation for Unplanned all by itself, is this central nexus and the whole mitigation discussion, which is a huge part. I know from past experience of what you all think about and what the people on the city side and the neighborhoods think about.
It's definitely a topic on its own. It's a good one.
So finally, just on the lightning round, what about you in your day job, in your working job here in Cambridge, here in Kendall Square? What does the future hold? And we can talk in the nearer term, which in your world is 1 year out, 2 years out, 3 years out, or in the longer term, which I assume for Boston Properties is 30 years out or whatever. What do you see? Where are we going? Where are we? Where are we going to?
Maybe I'm just overly focused in a small area, but I think that whatever happens, Cambridge is going to play a really important role in the national and world stage. I mean, it's on the news, it's in the stock market. You can look at who's thriving right now, and biopharma was going to do that anyway, frankly, but with COVID particularly, there's a renewed interest in it, and a lot of the solutions from, whether it be airborne pathogens or immunizations or neurodegenerative diseases or cancer, things we face as humanity, a lot of the solutions will come from right here in this area. So I don't think that the 2, 4, or 18-month outlook is anything but a lot of impassioned, intelligent people working on those problems in this area. So I think Cambridge will do quite well.
And that's a really interesting point for Unplanned, and it's something that's been in the back of my mind for a long time, and it's this interaction between you professionally and your private interest, that is Boston Properties' private interest of building buildings and creating spaces, the public interest, which might include the Cambridge public interest, people who live here, what they feel about their community and where they walk and how they move around. And then this much broader public interest of what's happening in the buildings. Are we creating a vaccine for COVID, for example?
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you have any final thoughts on that?
I never honestly thought of it, frankly, Sam. I've focused on the three legs of the stool so much, being yes, I represent a private interest. We have clients who, again, are human beings in those buildings, and so they're not just monoliths, and we have to represent their interests in the kind of environment they want to work and live in. So there's that inside-outside component. And of course, the public interest, and in my mind, it's always been very locally focused. You brought up a great point, which is, and this is probably unique to a Cambridge, is there a public interest, in a broader sense to what's happening here? I think absolutely, but I've never thought of that or its implications necessarily. It's a good point.
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating, and maybe that's very Cambridge specific. A lot happens in this particular community that maybe is not seen elsewhere, but it's a fascinating question. Anyway, Mike, I just want to thank you for joining us on Unplanned. It's always a pleasure talking with you.
Sam, I thank you. It's kind of funny. These are the sorts of conversations we have frequently. It's the first time we've done it with a camera. So
it's true.
This is very, very natural to me, and I appreciate the opportunity to do it.
Yeah, well, hopefully we can get you back on either on these topics or on other topics. It's true. We talk about a lot of things. We think about a lot of things, and that'd be great to have you back. But anyway, in the meantime, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for the opportunity.